I want to thank everybody for being here tonight and showing interest in this. I think it'll be fun to talk a little bit about this book. Some of you know this is the second book that I've written, and it really deals with my college years, the summer jobs that I held during college. It's the first in a series entitled Look Out, Here Comes Summer, My Incredible College Summers. Some of you have asked about why would you write a book? And it's interesting to know, I think, for many of you that I was a history major in college. I was interested in personal stories of individual experiences as they happened, obviously, to different times in our history and that sort of thing. To be candid, I think I also have to say that it's a bit of a vanity project. Sharon wasn't interested in spending $10,000 on a vanity project, but we worked it out so that at least some of this is for my own ego or to tell stories about my life. But the main interest that I had was to give information to my children and to my grandchildren about things that happened in my life. I think that I've lived an interesting life, at least to me it was interesting, or has been, and I wanted to leave some of those stories of my adventures to my kids and my grandkids. So the basis for the book, it's a nonfiction memoir. And as you know, a memoir deals with a certain period of time in someone's life, not an autobiography that starts when Charlie was born and goes through when Charlie passes away. But this is a particular time in my life when I was maturing. I was coming of age, if you will, and really deciding who I was and what I thought about things. And during those summers in college, I had some interesting summer jobs. And those jobs really came from a chance conversation that my father and I had with a person in Yellowstone National Park. My mother and sisters had gone to the gift shop and were waiting for the old faithful geyser to go off. And my dad ordered a cup of coffee and I ordered a Coke. And he started talking to the young man that waited on us. Turns out the fellow was a college student at Purdue University in Indiana. And my dad asked him all kinds of things about the job, how he got the job, how much he got paid, how long he was going to be there, all of those kind of things. After about 10 or 15 minutes of my dad talking to this fellow, we finished our drinks and went on to watch Old Faithful Geyser. And my dad mentioned to me that maybe I would consider taking a job somewhere than in my hometown, to go to National Park or maybe work somewhere like that. And that really was the instigation for me to seek out different jobs during my college years. The first book, the one we're going to talk about tonight, was from the fall and summer of 1966 when I worked as a Congressional Intern in Washington, D.C. That picture in the upper left-hand side is a picture of me and my father across the street from the National Capitol at the Rayburn House office building. The up corner where I'm sitting on the horse was this next summer, 1967. I spent the summer riding horses in the Colorado Rockies at Camp Shoshone up in Rollinsville, Colorado. Camp Shoshone was an exclusive all-girls camp, and I was one of about 8 or 10 men that worked at the camp during that summer. So you can imagine I was happy as a clam riding a horse in the Colorado Rockies with about 150 girls from the age 7 to 27 accompanying me. So that was a wonderful time. And Susie, that's on the call tonight, and Marilyn Wigman both worked with me at Camp Shoshone, and I appreciate them joining us here tonight. In 1968, a hometown friend and I got in a 67 Pontiac and drove from Texas all the way to Alaska. We were going to work on the pipeline. When we got up there, we found out that you really needed to have some skills that we didn't have, such as being a welder or running a forklift or a backhoe or something else, and you needed to belong to the union. And we had no skills and didn't belong to the union. So we ended up being janitors in the public schools in Anchorage, Alaska for the summer. But that gave us the weekends off to do hiking and camping and fishing and traveling around Alaska to see many of the sites. The last book in this series covers the summers of 1969 and 70. I graduated from Baylor University in May of 1969. I started law school, and then I got a draft notice that asked me to join the Armed Forces of the United States. And by September, I had gone to the induction center in Amarillo, Texas. There were about 250 of us in this auditorium, and this Marine drill sergeant comes in and says that some of us were going to be in the Marines, and that in the longstanding tradition of the Marine Corps, they were going to take volunteers. There were probably 200, maybe 250 of us in this big auditorium. No one raised their hands. So like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator movie, he said, "I'll be back." He walked out of the room, and 2 or 3 minutes he came back and said, "Johnson, Smith, Ledbetter." And I looked at one of my buddies from high school and said, "Did he say Ledbetter?" And he said, "Yes, he did." The next afternoon, I was enrolled in the Marine Corps in San Diego, California. So some people have also asked me about writing the book, the process, and it was a little bit easy because I had a journal that the congressman had asked me to keep that summer. So I had a lot of notes about things that I had done. My mother was also a product of the Great Depression, and she never threw anything away. She also created a scrapbook that was almost a minute-by-minute description of my family coming to visit me in Washington, D.C. that summer. When my mother passed away, that scrapbook and much of the correspondence came to me. So when I went back and looked at all these things, I had correspondence that I had written to home. I had correspondence that friends and neighbors and family people had written to me. I had mother's scrapbook, and I had my own journal. I also spent some time researching newspaper archives to look at different accounts of events that I either attended or personally witnessed or that I remembered from that time. And that was a big help to me. I also want to give thanks to part of the family of hope. It's great to belong to a family of faith that support you and encourage you. I'd like to give kudos to Jim Hankins and Shirley Meyer from the Hope community. Jim wrote a memoir, and I read it. And I contacted him and asked him about the process. He was very gracious and very kind. He introduced me to a writing coach and to an editor, and also to some printers. Shirley Meyer read the first draft of my original book, The Unexpected Conversation with Teenagers, and she was very frank and candid in her evaluation of that, and her advice to me really helped polish that manuscript and make it a much more enjoyable book. So thanks to Jim and Shirley for their help in me becoming a fledgling author. The process took about a year. 4 months or so where I was writing, 2 months where I spent to the copy editor, another 2 months to layouts and graphics to put it together. And then after I actually got a printed copy to do the proofreading and make sure that there were no errors before it went to the publisher. So from start to finish, it took about a year to do the entire thing. The book is about the summer and fall of 1966 and my experiences. Although there are some earlier events in my life that I recount in the book, primarily we're focusing on that summer. And I had received an improbable opportunity to work for a noted congressman from Texas in Washington, D.C. He was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and had been in the Congress since 1934. So that summer, he was a seasoned veteran and one of the senior leaders for the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C. Now, I am from a very small town on the left elbow of Texas in the high plains of the Panhandle, 18 miles from the New Mexico border. At its most, there might have been 3,000 people in my hometown. The last census said there were 1,800 people there. But when I grew up there, it was something that was instrumental in my life because I am walking and talking example of the adage, it takes a village to raise a child. Not just my family taking an interest in nurturing me and encouraging me and helping me grow up. People in the community did that for me. One of those was a rural route mail carrier who wasn't part of my family, but knew me, knew my family. And he asked me and my family if I would ride with him on the mail carrier route to go out 9:30 or so in the morning, come back at 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon so that we could visit. He was a big baseball fan, so we talked about baseball. We also talked about all of the farmers and ranchers that we delivered the mail to. One little place in particular had a bunch of hedges and trees around it. You could hardly see the house at all. And I asked him about that, and he said, well, he didn't personally know, but the rumor was that these people had moonshine. And the reason for that was we lived in a dry county. And dry county in that regard means not just arid, but you're unable to buy an alcoholic drink. There were no saloons, no package stores. You couldn't buy alcohol in the county where I grew up. But some people made their own, and some people went into New Mexico. But riding with this fellow was a great adventure for me at 9 and 10 years old, and talking to another adult about all the things that I was interested in. His family had been pioneers in the county, and he early in his career had helped Congressman Mahan get elected to Congress. He claimed that he was responsible for the congressman getting elected. I doubted that, but turns out he did have a friendship with the congressman, and he said that if I was ever interested, he would help me get a job in Washington, D.C. The other businessman that took an interest in me called himself my double uncle. If you want to know what a double uncle is, you'll have to read the book, but it was a close personal friend of my father from college and of our family. And he ran a hardware store and appliance store in town that he called the Trinket Store. He took me under his wing, and he taught me how to relate to people, to ask questions, and to find out what they might need. He also taught me some things not to say to people in a business setting. Don't talk about sex, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics, because we don't want to offend anybody. We want to sell them something. Those are things that I always remembered from my double uncle teaching me those things. But also the small town took an interest in me, my teachers, my Sunday school teachers, the pastor, the banker, the lawyers that worked with my father, and many more people in that community helped me grow and mature and decide what kind of person I really was. I think that's a piece of America that's lost. My children and my grandchildren haven't had those kind of adult mentors outside of our family to help nourish them and bring them along. And I regret that. It's also a reflection of the changing times, because Congress in 1966 operated very differently than it seems to today. I think the best adjective you might use for Congress today is dysfunctional, and it wasn't that way in those days. The job itself was kind of interesting. Mostly it had office duties. I did a lot of typing, and this was before email and electronic delivery of documents. So I did deliveries around the different offices, buildings, and to the Capitol. The map or overhead shot that you see there has the Capitol right in the center. And the lower left-hand corner is the Rayburn office building, where the office that I worked in was located. And to the right-hand side in the center, you see the white part there. That is the Supreme Court of the United States. And just below that, in the green top, is the Library of Congress. So part of my job was to take constituents and give them tours of the Capitol building, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court. I had to rough up on a lot of the facts and figures about those buildings, and I had to think about how I would take people around and give tips and talk about, as a tourist might have a tour to do that. I was also fortunate in that I was single, and I was asked to drive for the congressman a lot of times on the weekends or in the evenings. The other interns were married, and he did not want to disrupt their family life and ask them to do things at night or on the weekend, but he knew I didn't have anything else to do, so he would ask me to drive him. And I drove him to the West Wing of the White House. I drove him to the Pentagon. I drove him to the Chinese embassy, and I drove him to different locations in Washington, D.C., and it gave me more opportunities because I was fortunate to be able to drive and I didn't have other things to do at home. Now, many of you are old enough to remember the 1960s, but the main issues were civil rights, the Vietnam, the Middle East, of course, and the protests. That if you're going to have a protest, what better place to do that than in Washington, D.C. It's interesting to note that I grew up in a segregated town. The small town that I grew up in, my father worked in the courthouse, and I remember as a small child going to the courthouse, and we had a drinking fountain that said whites only and another one for colored people. We had a bathroom for whites only and another one for colored. 1964, you may remember, Congress passed the law, said that all public accommodations were open to everyone, that you could not discriminate based on race, creed, or color. And before that, Black people could not stay at some hotels or eat at some restaurants. And you know the story of our history in that regard. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act said that it's against the law to prohibit people from voting by artificial means, such as a literacy test or a poll tax that overwhelmingly discriminated against Black people. In 1966, the summer that I was there, the Congress considered the fair housing laws as it related to treating people fairly when you bought property. Could you live in a particular neighborhood? If you develop property, was it available to everyone? So the Civil Rights Act, as you remember, were profound changes in the United States and our culture during the 1960s. The other part of that was Vietnam. Our history in Vietnam stretched really from 1955 to 1975, but it really heated up in March of 1965 when the Marines landed near Da Nang in South Vietnam. And our troops became actively involved in the hostilities, and many then lost their lives as a result of that. There weren't enough people joining the armed forces in those days, so the selective service began increasing the amount of people subject to the draft. It started out at 15,000 a month, it grew to 25,000 a month, 50,000 a month, and at its peak, I believe 75,000 18-year-old men were drafted into the armed forces to serve in Vietnam. I was right in the middle of that, so that was part of my experience in college. I had a college deferment, and then when that went away and I began law school, I was subject to the draft. The Middle East, many of you know that they've been fighting over that land for 8,000 years. That was also a problem in the mid-60s because Israel was a relatively new country. It was established by hostilities with the Arabs who lived there and the Muslims who continued to live in that area for many, many years. So those three issues were a hot button for many things in Washington, D.C. And as I mentioned, if you're going to have a protest, what better place to do it than in Washington, D.C. I thought it'd be interesting for you to know some of the notable people that I met and I spent some time with that summer. Rufus Youngblood may not be a name that you recognize, but when I tell you what this gentleman did, you probably will remember the story. The picture in the top left-hand side there, the first one is Rufus Youngblood. The next one is Vice President at that time, Lyndon Johnson. They were leaving Parkland Hospital in Dallas right after President Kennedy had been declared dead, and Johnson was going to be sworn in as the new president. Rufus Youngblood was a Secret Service agent assigned to the vice president in the motorcade. He was sitting in the passenger seat in the front when he heard the rifle shots that killed President Kennedy. He immediately reached over, grabbed Johnson by the collar and shoved him down into the floorboard of the back seat of the limo. Then he scrambled over the seat and lay on top of Vice President Johnson, essentially using his body as a shield so that if someone shot at Johnson, that he would take the bullet instead. Johnson appreciated his bravery and his courage and his loyalty, and he named him as the head of the Secret Service detail at the White House. I met him at the West Wing of the White House when I drove the congressman there to meet with Lyndon Johnson. Rufus Youngblood and I were in the Roosevelt room, mere steps from the Oval Office, but I didn't get to see the president. I spent 15 or 20 minutes with Rufus Youngblood. The fellow in the upper right-hand picture with his arms folded is Nicholas Katzenbach. He was the Attorney General at the time I was in Washington, D.C. He's most noted for staring down George Wallace when they were integrating the University of Alabama. The law said that Black people could attend the University of Alabama, but George Wallace, the governor, said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And Nicholas Katzenbach, as you see in that picture there, stared him down for some 4 hours and eventually got Blacks admitted to the University of Alabama. Robert McNamara, as shown there on the left-hand side in the middle picture, was the Secretary of Defense. He was a brilliant student and a brilliant person, and he was in charge of much of the development of the strategy that the armed forces used in Vietnam. He was a brilliant person. He was very good at interpreting all kinds of data and taking different input and devising a scheme of how to accomplish things. He was so good in the business world that he was the president of Ford Motor Company, one of the largest companies in America at the time, at the ripe old age of 40. I met Robert McNamara 2 or 3 times, and I visited with him. He'd answer your questions, but he wasn't very talkative and he wasn't very friendly. He wasn't condescending, but you kind of get the feeling that he thought a lot of himself. At least that was my impression. The fellow in the middle on the right is Stuart Udall. He was the Secretary of the Interior. He had been a congressman from Arizona, but more notably, he was an All-American basketball player at the University of Arizona. I played college basketball, and one of the other interns was a college basketball player. So Stuart Udall would talk to us about basketball, tell us different anecdotes of his career, both as a lawyer, but also in college and playing basketball. He's a very friendly person and very open, and expressed a genuine interest in us. He came to the office several times, and he introduced me to Wallace Stegner, the author, and he recommended a book, Beyond the 100th Meridian, that had to do with exploring the Grand Canyon in the early days of the West. And since then, I've read many of Stegner's books, and I've enjoyed them, and I appreciated Stuart Udall for that insight. You recognize Gerald Ford there on the bottom left. He was the minority leader for the Republican Party, and he was good friends with Congressman Mahon. They played golf together. Their families and their wives went on vacations together, and he was in the office many different times. He always made a point of coming in and talking to the staff. He would do it in a very friendly manner. He talked to me personally, asked me what I wanted to do with myself, what I was interested in, told me that he thought practicing law was a noble profession, and he encouraged me in all of those endeavors. Sidelight of history is that Gerald Ford was the only person in our history to serve as the vice president and then as the president without ever being elected to those positions. But he was a wonderful man, and many of you in Colorado know he had a home in Vail and has many ties that he made when he lived and worked in Colorado. The last picture there, the fellow on the lower right-hand side, is Audie Murphy. He was a Texas boy. At age 17, lied about his age to join the Army. And before the age of 20, Audie Murphy had received every award that this nation gives to its soldiers for valor and courage in battle. He was the most decorated soldier in World War II. He was in a movie called To Hell and Back, which gave the story of his exploits during the war. And the climax was him personally holding off a German company while he was wounded, and he was one of the few left on his company able to fight. And he was awarded the the Medal of Honor by a Congress of the United States. He came to Mr. Mahon's office in relationship with some Veterans Affairs business, and I met him and visited with him. I always thought he was like Captain America. He was a Texas boy. He was a hero to all of us. I thought he'd be 6'3", 190 pounds, chiseled muscle everywhere else. But I was startled when I saw him. He was about 5'5" tall and maybe weighed 140 pounds. I towered over him, and I was a much bigger person than him. He wasn't exactly friendly, but he would answer any question. He was very polite, but he seemed very nervous. And as many of you know, later, he suffered what we now call post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I think that stemmed from his experiences during World War II. But I got to meet him and spend some time with him, and I remember it very well. These two ladies were the most fun. Marjorie Merriweather Post was the only daughter of C.W. Post, who is industry magnate known for Post Toasties or Post Cereal Company. He died in the early 1900s and left his fortune to his daughter, Marjorie Merriweather Post. C.W. Post bought 500,000 acres of land in West Texas. And I give you an idea how much land that was. That is 781 square miles. He bought all this land in the early 1900s when it was prairie land. It had not been broken by the plow. It was some ranches, but no people lived out there when he bought all of this land. Years later, she had sold much of the land, but kept the mineral rights. And she had mineral interest under the college that I attended in Levelland, Texas. When I was in school there, they blew in an oil well with a gusher. That, as you know, blows oil and water and debris and all this mess all over the campus. And I had a car that I had paid $60 for that I had taken to college. And it got covered with all of this debris coming out of this gushing oil well. The insurance people came to the student union. I went over and told them I was going to file a claim because my car had been damaged. I was hoping maybe they'd give me a car wash or a wax. They ended up paying me $150 for the damages to a car that I'd only paid $60 for. Marjorie Merriweather Post came to West Texas to see some of her properties and to visit the college that I attended, and she had asked if I would act as her chauffeur. The first day that I drove, we picked her up at the airport in Lubbock and took her to the motel, and she called me driver. The next morning, she introduced me again, or asked me my name and what I was doing, and said, "What does your mother call you?" And I told her, "My mother calls me Charlie, unless she's mad at me." And then she uses my full name. And she cut me off and she said, "Charlie, it is." The rest of the time I spent with her, the next 2 days or so, she introduced me to everyone as Charlie, as though we had been friends forever. She was a beautiful woman, and she was perhaps the richest woman in America at that time. Many of her treasures have been given to the Smithsonian, and her fabulous jewels are now on display at the Smithsonian Institution. Her daughter, Nadinia Post Hutton, was the product of Marjorie's marriage to E.F. Hutton. E.F. Hutton was a famous financier and stockbroker in the 1950s or so, a fabulously wealthy person, and their daughter was known by her stage name of Dina Merrill. She was a movie star and an actress on Broadway and many plays. She was also one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. Next to my wife, Sharon, she is a gorgeous lady. The best thing that I remember about these two ladies is that they were very gracious and they were very down to earth and very interested in me as a person, or at least it seemed that way to me. Dina Merrill flew in from Los Angeles to join us the second day we were on this tour, and we're having a dinner. And Marjorie Merriweather Post had asked me to join her entourage for dinner. I was seated at the far end of the table when Dina Merrill came into the restaurant. Everyone stood up. She and her mother exchanged pleasantries and hugs. We all got through the formalities. We're going to sit back down. And Marjorie Merriweather Post said, Dina needs to sit by Charlie. And she moved everybody down the table and asked me to sit next to her daughter, Dina Merrill. I was enthralled, as you might imagine. Turns out Dina Merrill had two sons. One was a year older than I was at the time, and one a couple of years younger. She was very interesting to talk to. She was very down to earth. She asked me what I was studying, what I wanted to be. She asked me how I got to be the chauffeur, what I knew about these people. She was very down to earth and very warm and welcoming. And I'll always remember the wonderful time these two ladies treated me and the way they were with me during the short time I was with them. I thought you'd be interested in some of the people that have read the book and given ideas of what they thought. So I want to read a few of these comments. I had been to DC before. It was as if I went again, this time with a guide who shared amazing history. You will be transported to similar experiences in your own life and how your early surroundings influenced you. This book about a small town boy who had an opportunity to go to Washington and serve as a congressional aide is a joyous read. The book depicts an America that no longer exists, but is not that far removed. One of the most enjoyable portions was hearing about how the people of his hometown influenced his life. I talked to my son, Andy. We went to lunch and right after the book was published, and he asked me how many editions or books I had sold. And I told him at the time, I thought 14. And he laughed and said, everybody in Morton, Texas must have bought one. It was as if I commissioned a gifted writer to chronicle the years I grew up in, the late 60s. Fortune had it that Mr. Ledbetter did just that. Loved the book as it brought back so many memories of living in a small town where you knew everyone and they knew you and genuinely wanted you to be successful. I appreciate that a lot about the people that have read this book, because that was my intent, to show that I'm a product of many different people encouraging me, mentoring me, nourishing me in my youth, and helping me be what I am today. The other part, I wanted to read a little bit from the book to give you a flavor for some of my writing and maybe pique your interest. I want to set this up a little bit and tell you that I was driving Mr. and Mrs. Mahon to a dinner for the American Legion at the Washington Hilton Hotel. That hotel later became famous, where John Hinckley shot President Reagan. So the same Hilton Hotel where I had deposited the Mahons was where this incident took place with President Reagan some years later. I dropped them off. I parked the car in a guarded parking lot, so I had a chance to spend a couple hours on my own. So I walked down to DuPont Circle, which is a famous circle on one of the avenues in Washington, D.C., close to what they call Embassy Row. And I want to read a little bit from the book that is set up by me walking down to DuPont Circle. I sat down on one of the curved benches and prepared to watch the world walk by. A young man I estimated to be in his mid-30s joined me, and we struck up a conversation. In my defense, and in the spirit of full disclosure, my 19 years on the earth before this had brought me into contact with 0 Jews, or for that matter, Muslim Arabs. I had read Exodus by Leon Uris and saw the movie with Paul Newman, so I knew something about Israel. This made me familiar with the typical American version of events in Israel and the establishment of the country. As many conversations go, we started with, "Where were you from?" I said, "Texas," and he responded, "Jerusalem." For some unknown reason, my mind automatically assumed this man supported Israel and its elected democracy. Forgetting I was in a cosmopolitan international city, I said something I regretted at once. "Don't you think Jerusalem should be the capital of Israel?" I said, expecting him to agree with me, and we'd continue our pleasant conversation. He did not respond right away, but I saw his eyes widen and his smile vanish. After a few seconds, which gave me time to realize I'd made a serious error, he told me no, he did not agree. He told me the Jews forcibly removed his family from their home and farm in 1948 during the early days of the struggle, and they became refugees in their own land. He claimed that the 1949 armistice, which gave control to East Jerusalem to Egypt and Transjordan and the western part of the city of Jerusalem, was illegal. He also told me the United States' unconditional support for Israel was wrong and caused untold damage to the Arabs. He implored me to come to Jerusalem and see for myself the crimes the Israelis continued to commit. At that point, it occurred to me I should get back to the Hilton, but I stayed on the bench. He spoke loudly and used his hands, but I never thought he might harm me. He obviously had more experience discussing this topic than I. At most, I added a or a really, but nothing else. This continued for another 15 or 20 minutes before he slowed down. I made an innocuous statement like, I hope things get worked out for all, hoping for an exit. Finally, seeing my discomfort with the conversation, he implored me to pray for peace. He offered his hand for a handshake, and I took it. He turned and walked away, and I, somewhat relieved, returned to the Hilton. The next summer, I was headed to Colorado during the breakout of the Six-Day War in the Middle East. As I heard the news over the radio, I recalled that conversation with the gentleman at DuPont Circle, and I wondered about that man and his family. Paul, I'd like to open it up to everybody and hope that someone has some questions.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and stop the participant sharing so everyone can see everyone else.
So if you have a question, you can kind of wave at me, raise your hand and unmute to ask. If you'd rather put it in the chat, you can do that and I'll help read those to Charlie. Yes, Donna.
You mentioned that this was a series or going to be a series. What are the others going to be about?
The other books will cover the additional summers that I spent during my college years. I worked at a summer camp in Rollinsville, Colorado, where I got to ride horses all summer, at an exclusive all-girls camp.
Yeah. So is each one of them going to talk about famous people that you've met?
Well, Marilyn Wigman and Susie Isabel are on this call. Were two of the famous people I met at Camp Shoshone. And my children's mother was another that I met at Camp Shoshone. The other book, the third book, will be about my adventures of driving with a hometown friend of mine to Alaska and spending the summer of 1968 in Alaska. And then 1969, I started the law school, but I got drafted to join the armed forces and ended up in the Marine Corps. So those will be the other books in the series, Donna. Thank you.
Greg? Oh, you just have to unmute yourself, Greg.
Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on how a modern day teenager sees Washington or should see Washington?
I do have some. I think most kids today, and certainly my experience in teaching a Sunday school class at Hope, would echo those same thoughts, that kids are very skeptical and somewhat cynical about Congress in general. And that's both the House of Representatives and the Senate. My personal opinion is that they need to be involved and make their own known thoughts and ideas and ideas about how to help us live better and to be a better society, because the gridlock, as I see it in Washington, is not helping. And I think the next generation has to help us.
Charlie, we have a question in the
Thank you.
chat from Patty Joe, but I'm guessing it might be from Clyde. After that much experience in Washington, did you ever consider going into politics?
I did, but only briefly. I learned enough about that I figured out I did not want to do that. I wanted to be a lawyer, and I did want to help people solve their problems and their issues, but I didn't want to get involved in politics, so I let that pass.
Other questions? I have to flip back and forth, so keep raising your hand or wave to me if Shirley.
Charlie, when did you lose your Texas accent?
Well, my wife says when I get on the phone with my sisters, it comes back pretty fast. So I can still talk like that, if you know what I mean. But I've lived in Colorado for over 50 years now, so a little of it has worn off. Shirley, I don't know if you were on earlier, but I was giving you thanks for reading my first draft of Unexpected Conversations with Teenagers and setting me straight on some of the things I needed to know. Thank you.
Sylvia, did you have a question?
Yes. Did you ever keep up with Meriwether Post?
I did keep up with Dina Merrill, and my mother wrote to Dina Merrill when Marjorie Meriwether Post passed away, but I did not ever see either of them again.
That was a fascinating story.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun for me.
I bet.
I have a comment.
Susie.
Yes. Charlie, you told me a story one time about your adventures in Washington. And I thought you would put this in your book because the congressman said to you, Charlie, it is imperative that you be impeccably honest. And I've never forgot that. I thought that was, you can live by those words.
Those are the exact words that he used, Susie. You're right. And I should have put that in there because I think that's good advice for all of us.
Absolutely.
Anybody else have a question for Charlie?
Kate, it looks like there's a question in the chat from, or did you already read that one?
I already read that one, Paul. Thank you, though. And if I'm missing you, just unmute and yell at me because I'm switching back and forth trying to see you all at one time.
Hey, Charlie Wig. I just wanted to, it's so good seeing you again. And I can't wait to get back to Colorado and be up close and personal once again and chat about old times.
Thank you, Wig, so much. I appreciate you being on here tonight. I look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, enjoy the evening. Glad to see all your friends and watching it also. And I wish you all the best of luck in the world and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us from Florida.
I want to thank my sisters and everybody else that joined in tonight. It's really been fun for me, and I hope you got something out of it.
Oh, Revlin, Charlie asked if you ever got to meet the notorious RBG.
I never did, and that would have been such fun. I did not.
What's your opinion of LBJ?
I admired LBJ tremendously on his quest for civil rights and helping the downtrodden. I parted ways with him eventually on support for the Vietnam War. primarily because I think he knew several years before he tried to get out of it, and because of vanity or hubris or whatever, he continued to do things that he knew weren't in the best interests of American soldiers, and I regret the loss of life. I was very lucky that I never served in Vietnam, but I was caught up in that generation, and I lost some friends, and many that just was not necessary. And I wish Lyndon Johnson had recognized that earlier. But I do appreciate him stepping forward, particularly as a Southern legislator and then president, to saying the way we treated blacks was wrong, and it just needed to be corrected.
Harry?
Yeah, I'd like to first ask you, what was your opinion of McNamara and the way he pushed LBJ, I think, into running the war?
McNamara was a very smart person, perhaps too smart. He's intelligent, personality, not exactly condescending, but you always got the impression that he knew he was smarter than you were. And the same thing, at 18, 19, 20 years of age, I supported them because I thought they knew what they were doing. As I came to read and learn much later, that they understood it was not a winnable war without terrific devastation to the country and much more loss of life, but yet they continued on with the same thing. And it reminded me of Einstein's adage that doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And I put McNamara and Lyndon Johnson into the same category regarding the war in Vietnam.
On a better note, or a more positive note, when are you and Hannah going to sing again?
Well, Sharon has been pushing us to get that together, so we're working on it. We're trying to get my youngest granddaughter, Marin, to join us. She's now the age that Hannah was the first time she sang, so we're going to see if we can talk Marin into
That'd be good.
joining us. Thanks, Harry.
And Clyde is asking, what did you do in the Marines?
It's a long story, but I ended up attending to the golf course in Quantico, Virginia. I went to the personnel officer in Quantico and they asked me if I could type. They said, I see that you have a college degree and that you started the law school. And I said, yes, all of that, thinking I was going to get some kind of administrative job. And they sent me out to the golf course to take care of delivering beer to the generals who had come down from the Pentagon to play golf at the golf course in Quantico. So my story is that I'm proud to say not 1 square inch of Virginia fell to the Viet Cong on my watch.
Yep, Sylvia?
I was going to say it before, but Charlie, you've lived a charmed life.
I have in many ways. Thank you.
Right.
Anybody else?
How'd you get to Colorado?
I had this game plan that I was going to get into law school, and some draft boards would allow you to stay in graduate school until you finished before you'd be subject to the draft. The University of Denver would allow students to start at law school during the summer term. So as soon as I got a degree from Baylor in Texas, I came to Colorado to immediately start into law school with this great plan that I was going to avoid the draft for another 3 years. Colorado University had also accepted me, but they wouldn't let you start until September. I had been accepted at Baylor's law school, but they wouldn't let you start until September. And I was afraid if I waited for that 3-month period without being in law school, that I'd be drafted. My grand plan didn't work. And when I told it to my father, he said, that's not going to work. And I said, why not? Sound like a brilliant plan to me. And he said, because he had sat on the draft board in our local county, and he had overruled other people's children and sent them to the service. And he said, when your number comes up, you're going to go. And that's exactly what happened. So I was in the law school when I received the induction notice, but that's why I came to Colorado. The fact that I had worked in Colorado for the summer. It was a magical experience. It was a wonderful time. And in some ways it was fantasy land, but I thought by relocating to Colorado, I could continue that magic and that fantasy. And that's what drew me to come here. Besides the beautiful mountains and the scenery, I love it here, and I've always enjoyed being here. So that's how I got here in the first place, and why I've stayed.
Anybody else?
Kate, I want to thank you too for inviting me to be a speaker tonight. It's been fun for me, and I hope for everyone else. It's sure good to see everybody.
Of course, Charlie, that was awesome. We thank you for all of your amazing knowledge and your stories. As we were listening, Arnie said, if you put out the audio book, he's going to buy that because he wants to like to hear you read. So just put the bug in your ear.
I'll get to work on that.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. This was our last soup supper, but we have lots of stuff coming up next week for Holy Week. So the Hope Happenings came out today. So you can see the services we're doing. You can also sign up for in-person Palm Sunday and Easter. That sign up is out. If you need any help with anything signing up, please just give me an email and I will help get you signed up. So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Do we get
Thanks,
to see
Kate.
Paul's baby?
Bye,
I saw
Jen.
Paul.
Bye, Zodi. Bye, Mimi. Bye,
Paul is
Wig.
maybe
Bye,
around.
Susie.
Bye-bye.
Let's see.
Hi, Charlie.
Bye.
There we go.
There's the baby.
Thanks.
Baby.
All right.
Hi, Charlie.
Aw, so sweet.
Bye, Charlie.
Bye, Charlie.
Bye, Charlie.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.